What comes to mind when you hear the name Hiroshima? Unfortunately, Hiroshima became known to the world as the first city in human history to suffer an atomic bombing. But did you know that Hiroshima once served as Japan's capital? In 1894, during the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan established its Imperial General Headquarters to direct military operations. To ensure strategic convenience, this headquarters was relocated to Hiroshima for a period of 227 days, until May 30, 1895, when Emperor Meiji stayed there. Hiroshima functioned as the de facto temporary capital of Japan. This First Sino-Japanese War can be considered the beginning of Japan's modern military aggression toward other Asian countries. It marked the tragic onset of a series of wars. This war of aggression eventually led to the Pacific War, continuing until Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, including the United States, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. But why did the First Sino-Japanese War break out in the first place? China. The Qing dynasty did not invade Japan, and Japan's troops were not initially sent to China, but to the Korean peninsula. At that time, in early January 1894, during the final years of the Joseon dynasty in Korea, impoverished peasants, suffering under harsh conditions, rose up in rebellion. This event is known as the Donghak Peasant Revolution or the Gabo Peasant War. Unable to suppress the uprising on its own, the Joseon government requested assistance from its suzerain state, Qing China, which then dispatched troops from Beijing. By the way, when we hear the word suzerain, many tend to associate it with the colonial policies of Western powers. However, the vassal state system rooted in the Sino-centric worldview known as the Chinese tributary system was quite different in nature. Colonialism aimed at direct territorial control or economic exploitation. Under such regimes, the sovereignty of the colonial power was absolute, and local cultures and systems were either denied or forcibly transformed. Above all, the primary objective was the extraction of resources and labor. In contrast, the Chinese tributary system, the suzerain-vassal relationship, was based on the Sino-centric worldview, with the main goal being to have neighboring countries recognize the cultural superiority of China. Unlike colonial rule, it involved little direct interference in domestic affairs. In exchange for acknowledging the authority of the Chinese emperor, vassal states were allowed to maintain political autonomy. The Chinese Empire generally refrained from military intervention and maintained a protector-like stance. However, there were exceptions. For instance, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, considered barbarians Yidi by traditional Chinese standards, intervened heavily in Koryo, which resisted Mongol dominance fiercely. The Yuan demanded royal hostages from Goryeo, enforced marriage alliances with Mongol princesses, and heavily interfered in internal affairs. Similarly, the Manchu Qing dynasty, founded by the Jurchen people, initially tried to support the crumbling Ming dynasty. When Korea refused to recognize Qing legitimacy, insisting on loyalty to the Ming, the Qing subjected the Joseon court to humiliating rituals and military subjugation. Thus, in some historical cases, the vassal relationship took on more coercive, militaristic forms. Even so, the Chinese tributary system brought mutual benefits in terms of cultural, scholarly, and trade exchanges. It was not merely a relationship of dominance, but also one of diplomatic interaction and influence. Given this background, it was only natural for Korea to seek help from Qing China's suzerain power that traditionally took on a protective role, but did not directly intervene militarily unless necessary. Indeed, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched his invasions of Korea in the late 16th century, the Ming dynasty responded by dispatching troops to assist Korea. Returning to 1894, when China began preparing to send troops in response to the Donghak peasant uprising, Japan, though not invited, also sent its military forces to Korea under the pretext of protecting its nationals. In fact, prior to this, in December 1884, a group of Korean reformists known as the Independence Party, inspired by Japan's Meiji Restoration and including figures like Kim Ok-gyun, a close associate of Fukuzawa Yukichi, launched a coup with Japanese support. Although the coup initially succeeded, it was quickly crushed by Qing troops within just 3 days. This incident became known as the Gapsun coup or Gapsun Jungbyeon. At the time of the Gapsun coup, Japan deployed 150 troops, but officially denied any intention of military intervention. Instead, it claimed that the Japanese legation had been burned and Japanese nationals had suffered harm, placing the blame on Qing China. Naturally, the Qing government refused to accept responsibility, and negotiations dragged on without resolution. Japan, under the leadership of Ito Hirobumi, persistently pressed the issue of the attack and injuries to Japanese civilians. At first, the Qing side dismissed the matter, but eventually agreed to conduct a reinvestigation, and stated that, if the accusations proved true, the responsible military officers would be punished. This concession led to the signing of the Tientsin Convention on April 18, 1885. One reason Qing China backed down was its deteriorating position in the Sino-French War over Vietnam, another of its vassal states. Under the Tientsin Convention, both Qing and Japan agreed to withdraw their forces from Korea, and to notify each other in advance if future troop deployments were necessary. However, when the Donghak peasant uprising erupted in 1894, the Korean government once again requested military assistance from Qing China, prompting Qing to send troops. Seeing this, Japan also redeployed its military to Korea. At that point, it is estimated that roughly 2,500 Qing soldiers were stationed in Korea, compared to around 8,000 Japanese troops. Alarmed by this growing Japanese presence, the Korean government quickly made peace with the peasant forces. With this peace agreement in place, Japan technically had no remaining justification to keep its troops in Korea. Nevertheless, Japan began interfering in Korea's internal affairs, and refused to withdraw its forces. In turn, Qing declared that it would not withdraw unless Japan did so. First, leading to a tense standoff. It was during this standoff that the Gyeongbokgung incident occurred on July 23, 1894. Japan claimed the incident was a spontaneous accident, but a draft document preserved at the Fukushima Prefectural Library clearly outlines a planned show of force targeting the Korean royal palace. This contradicts the long-standing Japanese narrative of a coincidental outbreak. The draft contains meticulous details of troop formations and movement paths within the palace grounds. Originally, the document referred to the plan to detain the king, but this phrase was later altered in red ink to protect. The attack on Gyeongbokgung Palace began at around 4 a.m. on July 23. By approximately 7 a.m., King Gojong was placed under control by Japanese forces, including Commander Yamaguchi, who reportedly held a sword to the king as part of the coercion. Even so, resistance from Korean soldiers inside the palace did not cease. According to the draft history of the Sino-Japanese War, gunfire continued to ring out in various parts of the palace well past 2 p.m. on the day of the assault. Under extreme duress, the Korean king was coerced into signing a formal letter to the Japanese government, requesting the removal of Qing influence. This letter gave Japan the pretext. It needed a legitimate cause for launching military action against Qing China, and thus began the First Sino-Japanese War. Interestingly, the conflict was originally referred to as the Japan-Qing-Korea War. However, the name was later revised. Including Korea in the title implied Japan was also at war with Korea, undermining Japan's claim of fighting Qing China to protect Korea. To maintain the narrative that Japan was defending Korea from Chinese dominance, the Korea element was quietly removed. The reasons often cited for Japan's demands to open Korea and its expansion into the continent include the Seikanron conquer Korea theory, which framed Korea's resistance as an insult that had to be corrected, and strategic concerns about Russian expansion southward. But beneath these justifications lay another motive: domestic political instability. Following the Meiji Restoration, a large number of samurai were left unemployed and discontented with the reforms. Many had not received sufficient rewards after participating in the Satsuma Rebellion. This created internal unrest, and redirecting the frustrations of these former warriors outward toward Korea and Qing China served as a convenient political solution. The Takebashi Incident of 1878, a failed armed revolt by disaffected ex-samurai, was one manifestation of this unrest. Japan installed King Gojong's father, the Daewongun, as a political figurehead. However, the Daewongun harbored resentment toward Japan and secretly contacted Qing loyalists, urging the Donghak movement to rise again in a pincer attack against Japanese forces. This plan, however, was discovered just before it could be executed and failed. By October of that year, 1894, Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War was nearly assured, and the Korean government was no longer in a position to resist Japanese influence. Toward the end of November, Japanese forces for the first time confronted and engaged the Donghak peasant army in battle. But the peasants, equipped with outdated weapons and lacking military training, stood no chance against the modernized, professional Japanese army. Moreover, the Japanese High Command issued a brutal directive. General Kawakami Soroku, deputy chief of the General Staff, sent a telegram to the Field Command stating, "The treatment of the Donghak party must be extremely severe. Henceforth, all are to be slaughtered." And so began a literal campaign of slaughter. Captured peasant soldiers were reportedly forced to wear straw capes and burned. Alivian execution method reminiscent of the infamous Mino Odori straw coat dance, used during anti-Christian persecutions in Japan. According to military journals from the time, 10 wounded prisoners were tortured and burned alive after being brought back to the barracks, while another entry describes 7 captured peasants being lined up in a field outside the city, bayonets affixed, and on the sergeant's command, all were simultaneously stabbed to death. These atrocities inflicted on common peasants were recorded in detail by soldiers and preserved in the war diaries. Documents related to the so-called slaughter order are still kept in the archives of the Library of the National Institute for Defense Studies, under Japan's Ministry of Defense. One key figure in Japan's early military intervention on the Korean peninsula was a Japanese officer named Koshiro Minami. He played a critical role in the fighting against the Donghak peasant army, acting under the extermination order issued by imperial headquarters. He led ruthless, mop-up operations against the peasant forces. Yet his name is seldom mentioned in historical records related to the Gabo Peasant War. Gabo Nomen Senso. Even today, searching his name online yields little information. Why is that? Some scholars suggest that his name and actions were deliberately left out of official records. After all, if Japan claimed it was fighting Qing China to protect Korea, then slaughtering Korean peasants would completely contradict that narrative. These massacres became politically inconvenient, especially during Japan's subsequent colonial rule of Korea. The death toll from the massacres varies by source. Japanese records cite figures of 30,000 to 50,000, while Korean sources estimate as many as 100,000 to 300,000 dead. In Korea, the Donghak Peasant Rebellion is referred to as the Donghak Peasant Revolution or Donghak Nongmin Hyomyeong. Some researchers classified Japan's actions as its first act of genocide, and in 2023, the archives related to the uprising were added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. This raises a critical question. While Qing and Japanese forces clashed on the Korean Peninsula and Japan ultimately emerged victorious, what happened to the Korean army? Surprisingly, Korean troops were split. Some sided with Qing China, while others supported the Japanese. At the time, the Korean government was torn by a bloody internal power struggle between two factions, one led by the Queen Min, the other led by the Daewongun, King Gojong's father. After the Gyeongbokgung Palace incident, Japan installed the Daewongun as the head of the government. Thus, soldiers loyal to the Daewongun supported the Japanese, while soldiers previously under the Queen's administration aligned with Qing forces. This led to an extremely bizarre situation, in which Korean forces were effectively fighting on both sides of the war. It is important to note that the Daewongun was not pro-Japanese. He was anti-Queen and anti-Qing, and Japan merely took advantage of his political stance to form a temporary alliance. Amid these developments, Qing China, facing mounting internal problems, could no longer sustain its military operations in Korea. Eventually, the war reached its conclusion. On April 17, 1895, the Qing government recognized Korean independence and signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki Nishin Koa Joyaku. Under the treaty, Qing China agreed to cede Taiwan, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the Pescadores Islands Penghu to Japan, pay war reparations to Japan, open several ports and cities to Japanese trade. With this, the First Sino-Japanese War came to an end. Japan had achieved its first victory in a major international war in the modern era.